By the winter of 1967, the United States had been embroiled in the Vietnam War for nearly 2 years, with troop levels escalating to over 485,000. The conflict had become a defining feature of American foreign policy, with the Johnson administration committed to preventing a communist takeover in Southeast Asia. Despite this substantial military presence, the war was not going as planned. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, a communist-led coalition of guerrilla fighters, had proven to be formidable opponents, employing a strategy of asymmetric warfare that exploited the weaknesses of conventional military tactics. The dense jungles and rugged terrain of Vietnam also favored the defenders, allowing them to launch surprise attacks and then melt away into the countryside. As the war dragged on, American strategists grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. The enemy seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time, making it impossible to gain a decisive advantage. The U.S. military had tried to adapt, adopting a strategy of search and destroy that involved sending large patrols into the countryside to root out enemy strongholds. However, this approach had yielded limited results, and the war was starting to look like a stalemate. In the midst of this uncertainty, the North Vietnamese were planning a bold new strategy. They would launch a coordinated attack on cities and towns across South Vietnam, aiming to catch the U.S. and its allies off guard and deal a crushing blow to their morale. This would be the Tet Offensive, a campaign that would change the course of the war and have far-reaching consequences for American foreign policy. The Tet Offensive was a masterpiece of strategic planning, designed to exploit the weaknesses of the U.S. military's conventional tactics. By launching a coordinated attack on cities and towns across South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese aimed to create a sense of chaos and confusion, making it impossible for the U.S. to respond effectively. The attack would be launched during the Tet holiday, a time of great cultural and spiritual significance in Vietnam, when many South Vietnamese soldiers would be on leave, visiting their families. The element of surprise would be crucial, as the U.S. military would be caught off guard, struggling to respond to a wave of simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts. The North Vietnamese had been secretly building up their forces in the months leading up to the attack, infiltrating troops and supplies into the cities and towns under the cover of darkness. They had also established a network of hidden tunnels and bunkers, allowing them to launch surprise attacks from unexpected directions. The U.S. military, meanwhile, was caught in a cycle of complacency, relying on their superior firepower and technology to keep the enemy at bay. But the North Vietnamese were not intimidated, and they were determined to prove that they could adapt and evolve, using unconventional tactics to counter the U.S. military's conventional might. As the Tet holiday approached, the North Vietnamese were poised to strike, their forces hidden in the shadows, waiting for the signal to launch the attack. The U.S. military, meanwhile, was unaware of the storm that was about to break, confident in their ability to respond to any threat that might arise. But the North Vietnamese had a surprise in store for them, one that would shake the very foundations of the U.S. military's strategy in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese Army's ability to launch a surprise attack on such a massive scale was largely due to their effective use of technology and tactics. One of the key factors was their use of 122mm and 107mm rockets, which they had acquired from their Soviet and Chinese allies. These rockets had a range of up to 10 kilometers and were capable of delivering a significant payload, making them ideal for attacking urban areas and military bases. The North Vietnamese also made use of recoilless rifles, which were lightweight and portable, allowing them to be easily moved around the battlefield. These rifles were capable of firing a variety of ammunition, including high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds, making them effective against both personnel and armor. In addition to these conventional weapons, the North Vietnamese also made use of more unconventional tactics, such as the use of tunnels and bunkers. These hidden passageways and fortified positions allowed them to launch surprise attacks from unexpected directions, and to escape from enemy counterattacks. The tunnels were often dug by hand, and were sometimes equipped with sophisticated ventilation systems and medical facilities. This network of tunnels and bunkers was a key factor in the North Vietnamese Army's ability to launch a sustained and coordinated attack during the Tet Offensive. The U.S. military, on the other hand, was heavily reliant on its air power and artillery. The U.S. had a significant advantage in terms of firepower, with access to a wide range of aircraft and artillery systems. However, the North Vietnamese Army's use of tunnels and bunkers made it difficult for the U.S. to effectively target them, and the U.S. military was often forced to rely on more indiscriminate forms of firepower, such as carpet bombing and artillery barrages. This had the effect of causing significant collateral damage, and often resulted in civilian casualties. Despite their technological advantages, the U.S. military was ultimately unable to effectively counter the North Vietnamese Army's unconventional tactics. The effectiveness of the North Vietnamese Army's unconventional tactics during the Tet Offensive can be seen in the significant impact they had on the U.S. military strategy. Despite being outgunned and outmanned, the North Vietnamese Army was able to launch a coordinated and sustained attack that caught the U.S. military off guard. The use of tunnels and bunkers allowed them to neutralize the U.S. military's technological advantages, and forced them to rely on more indiscriminate forms of firepower. This had the effect of causing significant collateral damage, and often resulted in civilian casualties. The U.S. military's inability to effectively counter the North Vietnamese Army's unconventional tactics was further complicated by the fact that they were fighting in a densely populated urban environment. The narrow streets and crowded buildings of cities like Hue and Saigon made it difficult for the U.S. military to maneuver, and provided the North Vietnamese Army with ample opportunities for ambush and surprise attack. In contrast, the North Vietnamese Army's use of tunnels and bunkers allowed them to move freely and undetected, and to launch surprise attacks from unexpected directions. The U.S. military's reliance on air power and artillery also had the effect of causing significant damage to the urban infrastructure, and often resulted in the destruction of homes and businesses. This had a profound impact on the civilian population, and helped to galvanize opposition to the war. As the U.S. military struggled to come to terms with the North Vietnamese Army's unconventional tactics, they were forced to re-evaluate their strategy and to find new ways to counter the enemy's use of tunnels and bunkers. The Tet Offensive marked a turning point in the Vietnam War, as it highlighted the limitations of the U.S. military's conventional tactics in a guerrilla conflict. The North Vietnamese Army's ability to launch a coordinated attack on multiple cities simultaneously, and to sustain a prolonged urban warfare campaign, exposed the weaknesses of the U.S. military strategy. The U.S. military's reliance on air power and artillery, which had been effective in previous conflicts, proved to be less effective in the urban environment of Vietnam. The destruction of homes and businesses, and the resulting civilian casualties, helped to galvanize opposition to the war, both in Vietnam and in the United States. The Tet Offensive also marked a shift in the balance of power between the U.S. military and the North Vietnamese Army. The North Vietnamese Army's ability to launch a coordinated attack on multiple cities simultaneously, and to sustain a prolonged urban warfare campaign, demonstrated their growing strength and capabilities. The U.S. military, on the other hand, was forced to re-evaluate its strategy and to find new ways to counter the enemy's use of tunnels and bunkers. The Tet Offensive also had significant implications for the U.S. military's doctrine and tactics, as it highlighted the need for a more flexible and adaptable approach to counterinsurgency warfare. The U.S. military's experience in Vietnam led to the development of new tactics and techniques, such as the use of helicopter-borne infantry and the emphasis on winning the hearts and minds of the local population. The Tet Offensive also had significant implications for the U.S. military's equipment and technology, as it highlighted the need for more effective and versatile systems for urban warfare. The development of new systems, such as the M16 rifle and the M60 machine gun, was influenced by the U.S. military's experience in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive ultimately marked a turning point in the Vietnam War, as it exposed the weaknesses of the U.S. military's conventional approach to counterinsurgency warfare and highlighted the need for a more nuanced and adaptable strategy. The U.S. military's failure to anticipate and prepare for the scale and ferocity of the North Vietnamese Army's attack led to a significant loss of public support for the war effort, and ultimately contributed to the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam in 1973. The Tet Offensive also had a profound impact on the U.S. military's doctrine and tactics, as it emphasized the importance of understanding the cultural and historical context of the conflict, and the need to develop a more effective and sustainable approach to counterinsurgency warfare. The U.S. military's experience in Vietnam led to the development of new tactics and techniques, such as the use of special operations forces and the emphasis on building strong relationships with local allies. The Tet Offensive also had significant implications for the U.S. military's equipment and technology, as it highlighted the need for more effective and versatile systems for urban warfare.